Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Carroll. I'm the CEO of the diaTribe Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our conversation today is on one of the most serious topics for people with diabetes, especially those who rely on insulin or sulfonylureas. The topic is hypoglycemia, which is not only negatively impacting the day-to-day lives of people with diabetes, but it's also unfortunately life-threatening. As we get started, I want to thank our generous sponsors of the Musings series who make this event possible and free for everyone. Huge thank you to our platinum sponsor, AstraZeneca. They've been developing therapies that not only improve A1C and time in range, but also significantly reduce the risk and consequences of diabetes complications. Thank you to our gold sponsors, Abbott, Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Vertex, and to our silver sponsors, Dexcom, Genentech, and Ionis. These companies are responsible for the development of groundbreaking technologies and therapies that allow people with diabetes to live healthier lives. In addition, they also provide essential support that allows diaTribe to pursue our mission to improve the lives of people with diabetes. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Alan Moses, who will lead our conversation today. He's trained in internal medicine and endocrinology. He was professor at Harvard Medical School, the chief medical officer at the Joslin Diabetes Center. He was the global chief medical officer at Novo Nordisk, and he retired in 2018, so that he's now an independent consultant for the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sector. And diaTribe is so extremely fortunate to have his knowledge, his expertise, his wisdom, his dedication as the chair of our board of directors. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Alan to lead today's panel discussion. Alan?
Great. Thank you, Jim, for that introduction and for really allowing this kind of a panel to take place. We're now 101 years since the first successful injection of insulin to rescue a young man in Toronto General Hospital from certain death. Since that first application of insulin, and as Jim has already said, one risk of insulin therapy has persisted, namely hypoglycemia or low blood glucose. And this occurs when a person has too much insulin available in their body relative to the amount their body requires at that moment in time. This can affect the way a person feels, but also can have far more serious consequences, including hospitalization and even death. During this panel, we're going to explore the evolving definitions of hypoglycemia, talk about the differences between clinical symptoms of hypoglycemia and the biochemical measurements that define the condition, try to understand the concept of hypoglycemia unawareness and what it means, and investigate how new technologies used to treat type 1 diabetes have the potential to dramatically reduce the risks of hypoglycemia and the consequences of developing it. Now, that's a tall order, but with me today are four individuals eminently qualified to participate in this discussion. We have two persons with type 1 diabetes who have lived with diabetes and the risks and realities of hypoglycemia for many years, and two academic clinician scientists who are trying to better define the levels of hypoglycemia while studying and developing approaches that can reduce the risk of developing hypoglycemia. So first, let me introduce Dr. Pratik Chaudhry. Pratik is a professor of diabetes at the University of Leicester in the UK and chair of the Diabetes Technology Network in the UK. His work as both a clinician and a researcher focuses on hypoglycemia unawareness, and the use of technology in the management of diabetes. He's the leader on the HypoResolve Consortium, which is working on solutions to lessen the impact of hypoglycemia for all people with diabetes, type 1 and type 2. He's also the principal investigator of a large multinational study evaluating the biologic and psychosocial impacts of sensor-detected hypoglycemia. Pratik, welcome.
Hi, thank you for that kind introduction.
Dr. Jason Gallia is a practicing endocrinologist and research at the Joslin Diabetes Center in Boston who focuses on type 1 diabetes. He serves as director of the Hood Center for Prevention of Childhood Diabetes and is co-director of the Clinical Translational Research Center at the Joslin. He has a particular interest in beta cell replacement strategies, including for those who experience severe hypoglycemia. He's contributed his expertise in this area through work with the NIH, National Institutes of Health, and with two companies, with Sema Therapeutics and Vertex, which acquired Sema, to bring stem cell-derived islet cells to clinical reality. Jason also happens to have been one of our diabetes fellows back when I was at the Joslin many years ago. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Alan.
Lisa Hepner is a film, TV director and writer who has lived with type 1 diabetes for 30 years, about as long as she's worked in the industry. Lisa is director, producer, and writer of the feature documentary, The Human Trial, which, if you've not seen it, is a powerful story about the quest to find a cure for type 1 diabetes. She's based in Los Angeles, although at the moment she's in France, where she and her husband, Guy Mossman, run Vox Pop Films, which specializes in producing commercials and content for the healthcare industry. It's a pleasure to have you join us, Lisa.
Thank you so much.
And finally, but not least, we have Eritrea Musa. She is diaTribe's social media manager, always with a smile, where she works to build the diabetes online community and connect as many people as possible with the information diaTribe provides. Having lived with type 1 diabetes for 21 years, Eritrea has worked as a diabetes advocate for most of her adult life. And in addition to her work with diaTribe, she co-hosts Diabetic Doing Things, a podcast that focuses on telling the amazing stories of people living with diabetes. It's great to have you join us for today's discussion, Eritrea.
Happy to be here, guys.
All right, so let's dive in. Jason, we're going to start with some of the concrete elements here. Let's start with how clinicians and clinical trialists define hypoglycemia, since there's been a consensus around the definition developed over the last decade. And by the way, that wasn't so easy to achieve. So why don't you define the different levels of hypoglycemia and why these numbers were selected?
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate it. And as you point out, it's important that we now finally have consensus so that we can all speak the same language. And what's been decided is as you pointed out, levels of hypoglycemia. And so level 1 is a blood sugar of between 70 and 54. And so for someone with diabetes, that's kind of the warning level. It's the level at which you got to be worried, I might go lower than that and run into a problem. But in people without diabetes, that could actually be a normal blood sugar. It is the point at which we start to see hormonal changes. So insulin levels should go down, glucagon should go up, epinephrine, cortisol, growth hormone should go up. And you might see some symptoms as well, some anxiety, sweating in that range. Then level 2 hypoglycemia is once you go less than 54. And that's when we start to get worried, because this may or may not have symptoms, but it's the point at which you're not getting enough glucose to your brain. And so you can have neuroglycopenia because of that. And so what that means is you might lose consciousness. You might get confused. You might become belligerent because there's just not enough sugar going to your brain. And then level 3 hypoglycemia is what we call severe hypoglycemia. And that's basically when you lose consciousness. You can't function, or you're just unable to treat yourself. And so if someone doesn't externally come and help you, your life is in danger. And that's what defines level 3 or severe hypoglycemia.
So Jason, what does that really mean to a clinician? I mean, if you see an individual with diabetes who's had an episode of severe hypoglycemia, how does that affect the way you approach that individual?
Yes. So severe hypoglycemia begets severe hypoglycemia. And so I actually need to be more careful with that person because I'm afraid they're going to have more severe hypoglycemia. And it's going to be because of me, because of I'm treating them. Because as you point out, we get hypoglycemia because of our use of insulin. And so I need to be more cautious in the recommendations I give that individual around insulin, because I'm potentially trading off avoiding long-term complications from causing an acute problem where they fall down a flight of stairs or get into a car accident. And so I really need to be tuned in to when people are having hypoglycemia, whether they're feeling it or not, and really trying to avoid people having hypoglycemia.
We're going to touch on a couple of those issues as we move on here, but let's leave that for the moment. That was really helpful. Let's now take it in a slightly different direction, but continuing on this issue of clinical definition. Pratik, I'd like you to discuss how the use of continuous glucose monitoring has altered our views of hypoglycemia, both in terms of the level of blood glucose measured And now, for the first time, or for the last 10 years, how long one stays at a particular low level.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. And just as Jason said, I think up till now, all the definitions are based on, I think of it in terms of one dimension, how low you went. But of course, if you feel symptoms and then you do a finger prick and your glucose is 54, you don't know how long you've been at 54 before you had those symptoms. And the experiments that were done, so just to kind of explain, the way we got to those definitions, and as Jason so very clearly explained, was people like me, we get people living with type 1 diabetes and we make them go, or people without diabetes, and we make them go low down to glucose of even 45, and we see what happens at different levels. And if we're saying people get symptoms or their brain function reduces slightly at a glucose below 50, that's you're keeping them at that level for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, and doing various brain tests. So what CGM has taught us is that you've got these two domains. You've got both the depth of glucose, but also how long you're down at that low level. And a study we've just done shows that actually quite often people aren't aware of how long they've been low before they get the symptoms. And so we're moving to this different era where we're talking about hypoglycemia risk in terms of how long you're spending below a threshold. And you'll hear people talk about time in range, which is the time you spend between 70 and 180, but also time below range, time you spend below 70, and time below in level 2. So time you spend below 54.
And so is hypoglycemia measured by CGM more common than we thought previously in terms of measuring discrete blood glucose with finger stick, or not at all, and just looking for symptoms?
Absolutely. And so, people like us, as I said, the muggles, if we wear sensors, we will often get low readings that we're asymptomatic for. And actually, the study I was just talking about, we found that for people with kind of average glucose control, you're getting an average of 6 or 7 episodes a week when the glucose is dropping below 70, but people are only getting symptoms 2 or 3 times. And actually, many of the times people get symptoms, they're not actually low on the sensor. So what we've found is when you feel symptomatic, and you might recognize your glucose is dropping, that you're feeling that you're low because you're in a situation that might create hypoglycemia. You've corrected a high glucose, or you've done some exercise, so you're a bit more in tune to thinking, am I going low? And you might get those awareness, that feeling that I might be low sooner. And other times, if you're concentrating on something else, you might not feel it. So we reckon people pick up about a third of the time their sensor is low. And that's people who, by all other measures, conventional measures, we know have good awareness and are at very low risk of severe hypoglycemia. So I think one of the things we're learning is on sensors, we're going to see these readings, particularly those readings that Jason called kind of those level 2, the level 1 alert ones between 50 and 70. As it's okay not to feel them, but if you see them, we need to react to them, if that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. All right. So now I think I hope the audience has a better sense of how clinicians look at hypoglycemia. That is, how they define it, when it really matters. But let's turn to Lisa and Eritrea to talk about the lived experience of type 1 diabetes. And both of these individuals have experienced hypoglycemia. Both have experienced episodes of severe hypoglycemia. So let's specifically see how more recent definitions of hypoglycemia, including the concept of time below range with CGM, altered the way that they, as individuals with type 1, look at hypoglycemia, worry about it, make efforts to avoid it at all costs. Lisa, as I mentioned in the introduction, you were, the creative force behind the movie The Human Trial, and I really do encourage everybody to try to see that movie. And that movie specifically looked at the early stages of beta cell replacement therapy as a potential cure for type 1 diabetes. But the fact was that hypoglycemia was a driving force for many of those, not just because of entry criteria of a trial, but was a driving force for those individuals to want to participate, to want to see if beta cell replacement could work. But having had that experience and your own experience, what does hypoglycemia mean to you, and how does it impact your life on a daily basis?
Well, great question, Alan. And I want to refer to what Eritrea said when we were off camera, that the first 15 minutes after you've been diagnosed are the ones that you remember. When the doctor or the nurse walks into a room and expresses, a reaction to your diagnosis. Okay, so I didn't know that, but that's a really good point, and I'm going to psychoanalyze myself. So I was diagnosed 32 years ago in Edinburgh, Scotland, when I was studying abroad. And, my well-meaning doctor checked my feet and told me it was, why are you doing that, sir? Oh, because it's the leading cause of amputation in Britain. Shortly thereafter, I think probably within the first 20 minutes, I watched a video on hypoglycemia. And it was a very stark representation of what could happen. Because I think back then it was like, we're going to scare you into really good control. And, I was kind of diagnosed on the earlier end of, being in DKA. So I literally was told, oh, you can bike home now, have lunch, and then come back. And I was like, are you sure I should get on a bicycle? Like, don't you think I'm going to go low and end up unconscious, seizing on the floor? So that had a profound impact on how I looked at hypoglycemia. And again, I've had it so long, diabetes type 1, that I didn't have the CGMs. I had finger sticks. So that took 60 seconds. So all I knew was that I was feeling badly, and I had 60 seconds before I was told I was feeling badly. And then I would have to take my sugar. And I was running a lot. I was exercising constantly. So I would run my sugars higher because I would rather be safe in the short term. And at 21, I didn't think so much about the long term. Now I do. And now I have my CGM. I have, my phone here. It gives me instant feedback. And I'm very aware of what range I need to be in to avoid complications. But
so
I was scared.
Yeah, no, that was perfect lead in to the next question, which was, can you talk a little bit about fear of hypoglycemia? It sounded like that started with your first visit, and the concept of you're getting back on the bicycle to ride home to your dorm or your apartment or wherever you were. Are you still very afraid of hypoglycemia?
Yeah, I'll be honest. Very afraid? Well, no, because I have my CGM.
Because that's the next question. And how has CGM impacted your living with type 1 diabetes and with the risk of hypoglycemia, and more specifically, severe hypoglycemia?
Well, I can catch it before it goes to severe hypoglycemia, right? Because we can set our range, and then it beeps at me and an air raid siren goes off. And so I'm like, okay, now is the time that I have to, deal with this. But I do have a real world example for you. And it was just yesterday. And I was with my dear friend who was diagnosed in England at the same time I was. And we've known each other 32 years. We're walking around Annecy in France. Beautiful, if you've ever been. And I have 2 hypos. Like, I had a hypo along this waterfront. And I thought, gosh, aren't I doing a speech on hypoglycemia tomorrow? Like, am I qualified to be doing this? So, I was quite miserable. And I thought, how did I do that with my, with my CGM? I had my sugar, of course. I treated it. I went forward. But did it kind of cast a pall on this most beautiful day? Yeah, it did. Because I feel like a failure, right? How does someone with all this technology not get it right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I don't think we're going to have time to probe all the psychosocial elements around that, but the concept of responsibility for your blood glucose can weigh heavily on some individuals. And yet there are things that we cannot, no matter how good the technology is, there are things we cannot completely control. So Eritrea, turning to you with sort of similar questions, can you describe some of your experiences with hypoglycemia and specifically severe hypoglycemia? Because I know that has been an issue.
So I was diagnosed as an 8-year-old in 2002. So that's a long time ago now. But as a child, I remember that I developed symptoms of Hypo Unawareness as a teenager and as a child. I started going to a lot of diabetes camps So I was very lucky to have access to an incredible diabetes education from people here in Texas every summer. But as an adult, those episodes of hypoglycemia and severe hypoglycemia have gotten more frequent and a bit more, I think scary is the word, but I try not to think of it that way. And so I guess I'll give you guys a specific instance. I'll take a page out of Lisa's handbook. But I think the worst experience I ever had was at a time when I was in between CGMs, because insurance here in this country is very interesting and you can only fill them a certain amount of times. And so I just was without a Dexcom because I was out of them that week. They were on their way to my house. So I had woken up early and gone to work. At the time, I was a developer for a school district here in Texas, had my coffee and my blueberry muffin, and I dosed for it the same way I would every day. Tested my sugar. I was 190, took my little insulin and minded my business for the next 15 minutes. About 3 hours later, I woke up in a hospital room and I had burned off half of my face with carpet burn from seizing on the floor. So the paramedics later told my family that they think that the monitor gave me a false reading, like that I just got a false reading from my blood tester, that I was possibly already low and gave myself a ridiculous amount of insulin for coffee and a blueberry muffin, which later put me into a seizure. And I woke up with like having carpet burn on my face for an entire year also made me feel like a failure. Like, how can someone who's had diabetes for this long still be having these types of episodes? I'm very lucky to have access to a CGM, a Dexcom, and all of those things. But I'll tell you that my last hypo that was really, really bad was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I was at home with a friend. We were watching a movie. I'd taken too much insulin that day. My pump was beeping. But because I have Hypo Unawareness, sometimes I don't necessarily take count of all my beeps and I don't feel it, right? Like I don't physically feel the symptoms of hypoglycemia. I don't get sweaty necessarily right away or dizzy or anything. And by the time I catch it, my blood sugar is already LOW, right? So in that situation, they poured syrup down my throat. They were asking me over and over again where my Gvoke was, where's your Gvoke, where's your Gvoke? And I was like unable to respond. So at 30 years old, you would think that after having diabetes for 21 years, it wouldn't be as frequent, but it is something that I still think about and worry about almost on a daily basis.
And I think it may be worthwhile for the audience to also understand what other assistance you have at home.
Sure. So I have a service animal. I have a diabetes service animal. She's a little older now. So it was funny when we did the initial call for this, Alan was like, she's a bit older now. And she's still detecting the way she used to. And no, the answer is no. But I have a service animal. I do wear a CGM. I share it with my family members. I'm lucky enough to only live 4 minutes away from my parents, who have driven to my house at 4:30 in the morning and banged on all my windows and doors to wake me up. So I have a support network, but it's still just a concern.
And that really, and you've raised this already, the issue of hypoglycemia unawareness. I mean, obviously a particularly frightening manifestation of hypoglycemia. We're fortunate that one of our panelists has spent a lot of his professional career dealing with and focusing on hypoglycemia unawareness. Pratik, why are some people more prone to this than others? That they just don't recognize? Well, define what it is, really. I mean, it should be obvious by the name, but it may not be. You're on mute. Pratik, you're on mute.
Sorry, that. So yeah, most people will get some symptoms, and as Jason said, the way we define it, the way we explain it or experiment is if we take someone who doesn't have diabetes and you make them gradually stepwise low, we know that by about kind of 60 or 65, you start getting some adrenaline, they start getting some shakes, some symptoms, and then as you get low. And if you think about it, the level at which you get your hormones and that your brain picks up the glucose needs to be a little bit higher than the level at which you start getting confused, where you can't recognize that I'm getting these symptoms and make sense of them and take some treatment. And what probably about 30 years ago, one of my mentors found out is if you have one hypo and then the next day we make your hypo again, then your symptoms and your hormone responses are halved. So over the course of your lives, an average, if there is such a thing, but when people with type 1 diabetes will have between 2 or 3 episodes of hypo a week. So by the time you've had diabetes for 20 years, you've had 1,000 hypos clocked up, over your time. And so it's not. So obviously then that gap starts to reduce. And if you've had a few more of the more severe hypos early on, that might get a bit lower. So that means that by the time, you might raise some adrenaline, but that might be much lower than when you get confused. So you don't have that warning sign. And the first thing is that your people would say to me, I specialize. So most of my clinic is full of people referred from around the country who have Hypo Unawareness, because I used to run the islet transplant program. And so there's something a lot of people said was, I was too confused to recognize I was confused. And people around me pick up that I'm low. A great question is, do other people pick up that you're low before you feel you're low? And so that's what defines impaired awareness. And that's what puts people at that risk of then those sort of episodes that, Richard, you've kind of got, you've shared with us.
Yeah. So taking that, Jason, when you first see an individual with type 1 diabetes in the office, in the clinic, can you predict whether they might be at risk for hypoglycemia unawareness if they haven't already had it?
Yes. When you're sitting down and talking with them, there's certain flags. And so really, I look at the duration that they've had diabetes for. People who have longer duration of diabetes are at higher risk for having hypoglycemia unawareness. I look at their level of control. So if they come into my office with an A1C of 5.5, I mean, first I congratulate them, but then I'm very worried about them as well. And I'm like, if you have a CGM, let's look at that right now. Because even if I ask them, are you having hypoglycemia? They might tell me no, because they're unaware. But then we look at their CGM and we find these episodes, and I have to have this discussion. Well, I'm happy that you're able to bring your blood sugars down, but I'm worried for you as well, because I don't want you to get injured, because you're having these episodes and you're not aware. So really, those are the flags. And then the other one is if they tell me that they're having a lot of hypoglycemia, well, then I'm worried again that they're going to have more hypoglycemia, because as you heard, biochemically, hypoglycemia begets hypoglycemia. Once you have one episode, it predisposes you to the next, and so on and so forth.
So
yeah, I think when people, go ahead, Pratik.
So I was just going to say, I think in the recent literature, there's a couple of flags that you might consider. And again, these need to be validated. But if your time below range is more than, I've seen a couple of papers now suggesting a cutoff about 7% of your time below 70 or 2.5% of time below 2.5 marks you out as someone with higher risk. And then the other is this very simple question: how often are you aware that you're going low? 1 is always, and 7 is never. It was a question that, Lisa, you talked about being in Edinburgh. Anne Gold from Edinburgh invented this score back in the early 90s, and it still marks out people. If you think, if I draw a line across the screen and say, how often are you aware when you're going low? 1 is always and 7 is never. If you're at the back end of that screen, then you're hypo unaware and you're at higher risk. And as Jason said earlier, that means that we both need to think about what's causing your episodes. How can we build a slightly bigger buffer for you, and maybe put in place those safety nets of technology that will maybe replace some of your physiological awareness with technological awareness.
Exactly. And I think one of the key points that everybody should take home is that hypoglycemia unawareness happens because the brain accommodates to multiple episodes of hypoglycemia and no longer recognizes it as really being hypoglycemia, even though it is, because it then shuts off when it gets too low. So
it's a bit like when you're going on stage. The first time you go on stage to give a presentation or a big talk, you get the nerves. And it's a stress response. So the first time you have a hypo, you have a stress response. But if you go on and give a talk, or you're playing every day, then you don't get that stress response. You might get a stress response to something else, but you don't get it to that particular stimulus. And that's kind of what happens to hypoglycemia. But it says, I've seen this before. It's all right. Don't bother stressing about it.
So, Pratik, when you were at King College with Stephanie, a lot of your effort, Stephanie Emil, for those in the audience, a lot of effort was devoted to taking individuals with hypoglycemia unawareness and making them more aware of their low blood glucose. So what approaches can actually make a real difference for people who do suffer from hypo unawareness?
So just as we learned in the early 90s that if you have a lot of hypos, then you start losing that stress response that drives your hypo symptoms. So it makes sense that if you don't have any hypos, you might regain those warning signs. And that was, again, there were 3 small studies, 15, 20 people each, proved that in the mid 90s, that if you avoid hypoglycemia completely, you can regain some of those symptom responses, but you don't regain all of them. It's been very interesting in the large studies of using technology. While the technology can beep and reduce your risk of having a severe hypo, it hasn't really been shown to bring back all your warning signs as effective as we'd appreciate. And actually, there's a big study ongoing to find that. But the best thing you can do is of try and avoid the episodes and just keep yourself above 70 and avoid any time below 70. And that in about half the people, that seems to restore awareness if you can do that.
And obviously, and it's already been mentioned by both Lisa and Eritrea, CGM has played a big role in terms of preventing severe episodes of hypoglycemia. But it's not foolproof or fail-proof, because we've just heard that Lisa had an episode yesterday with her CGM on where she got symptomatically hypoglycemic. Eritrea has had episodes of severe hypoglycemia with loss of consciousness despite wearing CGM. So it's helped a lot because it makes people more aware of where they are and for how long they are where they are, but it's not foolproof. Okay. Eritrea, you have had, and you've already talked about this, hypoglycemia unawareness. How long has that been? You said that started relatively early when you were a teenager. Is that correct?
Yeah. So when I was around like 16, 17, I think it was interesting when Dr. Chowdhury said like how many hypos a person has. Like if you have 2 to 3 a week, if I've had diabetes for about 8 years, like that's a lot of lows.
Yeah.
And were you very conscientious about keeping your blood glucoses, your overall glucose control in very good range at that time?
Not really. I think I was more of just like a regular teenager, trying to be active and live my life. My parents were really in charge of my diabetes and I helped make most of the decisions, but they were my support network. I would say that as an adult, it has definitely been something, because something that really piqued my interest, as Dr. Gaglia said, patients who have lower A1Cs. Because I am one of those patients. I love to check the box and have a great 6 A1C. I am a straight A compliant patient student. So now as an adult is something that I do have more often.
But as you point out, there can be risks to that as well.
Sure.
And so it's that balance. I mean, the other thing that we learned from we at Novo Nordisk learned for some clinical trials was that some of the individuals most susceptible to hypoglycemia were those who actually had higher blood glucose levels, but a lot of peaks and valleys, a lot of swings. So there are two groups that really are at risk: those who are in very tight control, where there's little margin for error, and those who aren't in such great control, but they may try to take a little bit of extra insulin when they realize they're too high, and then they take too much and it just drops too far. Okay. Lisa, we're going to come back to you. How has your education, particularly through filming, directing, writing the human trial, take that in the other direction, writing, directing, and filming the human trial, brought you into recognition of some of the challenges that people face with hypoglycemia? And more specifically, your view about the need for new and improved therapies for type 1 diabetes. So, we're here in a relatively sophisticated era, certainly compared to 30 years ago when you were diagnosed, or 21 years ago when you were diagnosed, Eritrea. But we cannot guarantee that every person with type 1 diabetes, no matter how sophisticated the technology they use, will be free of the risks of hypoglycemia. Not least of which because sometimes the technology fails. I mean, that's technology. But with that background, how has that affected your view of the need for new approaches?
I think the need is great. Absolutely. As you point out in the film, one of the patients especially was motivated to stop her very serious hypoglycemic episodes. That was Marin, patient 1. Now, she had all of the CGMs. She wasn't on closed loop at the time, but she didn't wake up to the beeping noise. So when she doesn't wake up. And so when her husband would go on business trips, her mom would sleep with her in the same bed. And she's 36. But it was because she just didn't wake up to the sounds of it, the alarms. And same with Greg, who had more challenging hypoglycemic episodes. But even when we were filming, he slept through one. And, his wife had to like shake him awake and call 911. So it's not foolproof or fail safe, as you point out. And I think also we get really immune to all the beeping noises, and you're like, okay, well, maybe I can raise, my range or whatever, just so it stops constantly beeping at me. And then you kind of want to just not always address it, because you could be on a Zoom call. You could just be tired and don't want to eat anything. You've just eaten. The last thing you want to do is eat more sugar or eat more carb. And I think in terms of developing new therapies, I wouldn't even say develop new therapies. I would say find a cure. And, as we say in the film, not me, but was it Eugene Brandon, who worked at diaTribe, was there's nothing that can replace our own cells, our own thinking cells. There's nothing. And that bar is very high. I see that. I filmed it for 8 years. I understand that. But I would really love to put so much more time and effort and money behind finding that elusive cure, because I think it's closer than we think. I'm talking to experts. Everyone on this panel is an expert, and you have the inside track on knowledge as to where we're at right now. But I think the therapies are pretty good. I just think diabetes is a really tough disease. Like, I don't know how to stop the beeping. How else am I supposed to wake up? Like, how do you meet both needs? I don't know.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point, and it gets to the question of diabetes distress and how much of an impediment to in quotes, a normal life come with somebody who is feeling the pressures of using technology, relying on technology, worrying about their blood glucose and avoiding hypoglycemia. Does that, what does diabetes distress mean to you, I guess, is really what I'm asking. And Eritrea the same.
I look at it as this interior monologue that I have that no one else can hear. It's like this ticker tape that goes underneath my skin, and it just intrudes on all of my thoughts. And it takes away sometimes if I can be eloquent, because I'm thinking constantly, where is my sugar at? And that gives me anxiety, and when perhaps I didn't have the instant feedback loop, maybe I was blissfully ignorant and I didn't know that I had 2 arrows going down. Is that good? No, that's not good. Ultimately, that's not good. But in the, in the short term, I didn't start to panic, because to me, that's the distress, is when you start to panic,
And Eritrea, how about you in diabetes distress?
I think for me, it's an annoyance, but it's also this job that I can never take a break from. I had an endocrinologist once tell me that diabetes was like riding a bike, except the bike is on fire, which is like something that you can do, but it's really difficult all of the time. So it's not so much the beeping that gets to me, or the constant data, or the appointments, or the insurance, or just all the things that you have to do to keep up with it. It's just nonstop, but it's more or less this idea that I never get to take a break. So that's a little bit more distressing. And then it leads me to think more about people whose break has come, but it's because they have lost their lives to hypoglycemia. And because I went to diabetes camps as a small child, I know a lot of people with diabetes. I met 500 new people with diabetes every summer. How many of us do you think have not made it? So that's the distress that really gets to me more than anything.
So you really worry a lot about the consequences based on your lived experience, knowing other people with diabetes who have had bad outcomes.
I know that there are people who are calling into this call today who are on this Zoom session because we lost a member of our diabetes online community like 2 weeks ago from a car accident because she was low. So yeah, it's something that we think about, and I think about all the time.
All right. Well, that's a pretty heavy background, but I want to move on anyway, because we have other issues that we need to address. And one of them relates to new research initiatives in this area that tell us about the frequency and consequences of hypoglycemia. And Pratik alluded to this already, but we're going to come back in more detail. We need to remember as we listen to this that most of these data come from combining large data sets from many clinical trials, and the results may not speak to the experience of a given individual. So your experience out there, if you're listening, may not be what comes from these, but still, we have learned a great deal. Pratik, you've been deeply involved in the Hypo Resolve Consortium project that's underway in Europe.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about it and what its goals are and how the consortium is pursuing these goals?
So thanks. So there's kind of a number of different aspects, but maybe I'll focus on the bit that I'm leading, which is looking at the impact of low sensor glucose. As Jason said, up till now, we've been, as clinicians or healthcare professionals, telling you about this is the level, this is that level. And, with CGM, people are finding lots of these episodes that they weren't aware of. The CGM was low through the night, they didn't wake up. So that's causing a lot of distress and anxiety. So we put blinded CGM, so the patient couldn't see what was going on 600 people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes for 10 weeks. And we gave them an app and said, every time you feel hypo, click the button and tell us what symptoms you had and how long it took you to recover, and what you think your glucose was. And of course, some of those people were wearing their own sensor and they reacted to that. And so we've got 3 levels of hypoglycemia, if you like. We've got events which no one recognized, undetected events. We have events where people were notified by the device, but they didn't have any symptoms. And then we have those with symptoms. And so in that million hours of CGM, we've got about 30,000 episodes where the sensor was low. But only 20% of those, the patient hit a button within an hour of it to say I felt low. And of the 15,000 events when people were low, half the time, actually the glucose wasn't even below 70. So what we're finding is the experience of hypoglycemia and symptoms that you recognize as hypoglycemia might be slightly different than what we're seeing on CGM. Of course, they marry up 30% of the time. The other thing that we're seeing is that thankfully, really thankfully, episodes that Eritrea mentioned of someone having a terrible event from hypoglycemia are incredibly rare. So when you use blinded CGM, you will often find in the early days of CGM, we often found, as Jason will testify, people with a flatline glucose below 40 the whole night, and they just didn't even know about it. Those early CGMs didn't give you a reading. You have to, you brought it back to the clinic and then you had a look at it. So I want to balance a little bit, I think, what the data is saying, because what the data we found was overnight, if you're low, we then asked them to rate their mood in the morning. How well did you sleep? How do you feel? Right? And turns out if you didn't feel the low, it doesn't have any impact on how you feel. But if you were woken up by your device or you got symptoms, it doesn't matter if you're low or not. You lose quality of life, you lose sleep performance, you feel grottier the next day. So there's this balance between saying, hypoglycemia, as Jason said earlier, can be life-threatening very rarely. Hypoglycemia can cause seizures, and when it does, and those events seem to be concentrated in individuals who are predisposed to it, right? And then there's a huge bunch of other people who are really scared of hypos because of those events, but actually their risk is really, really low of any of those events. And so there's this balance between what's your actual risk and how scared you are. And too often it's out of proportion. So people who have a lot of fear actually have low risk. And some of the people who have a lot of risk perversely have very little fear because they're just used to it and they've had a severe hypo and they carry on. And I think where we're moving to is trying to match those two things up a little bit. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah.
It does. And I think one of the tremendous advantages of that approach is that you remove the anecdotal experiences of an individual. I mean, they're not really anecdotal, but they happen to a single individual, and they make a profound impact on both the clinician and, of course, the individual experiencing it. And you take that to a large population where you can look at a lot of data points in a lot of individuals and begin to understand some of the nuances, some of the subtleties of hypoglycemia and what it means clinically, what it means biochemically, and what it means in terms of prescribing therapies. And to that point, Jason, this issue of hypoglycemia unawareness with episodes of severe hypoglycemia is still a real clinical problem. CGM obviously has helped to some degree. Insulin pump therapy has helped because it provides a more somewhat more physiologic application of insulin, but it's really marrying those two things together that makes the bigger difference. So you want to speak a little bit about AID, or automated insulin delivery systems, and their impact?
So the automated insulin delivery systems, or what we have now, are the hybrid closed loop systems. I think the best way to describe it for a lot of my patients is actually liberating, because it really gives them a lot more freedom. And I'm just going to give you an example of one of my patients who was actually separated from her husband, but they actually still live together because she wouldn't wake up from her CGM alarms at night. And so he would wake her up because, I mean, that's what they would do. But she actually then got a hybrid closed loop system, and they were able to actually truly be separated again, because the hybrid closed loop system would prevent her from getting hypoglycemic like that overnight. And then she felt comfortable, and both of them felt comfortable for the living situation that they wanted to be in. And so it's really amazing. And then with that, it lets us be more aggressive in treating somebody, because it's like, what is the right target for that person? And so some people, the target is 7, but it's 7 without hypoglycemia. And other people, it's 6.5, but it's 6.5 without hypoglycemia. Maybe it's going to be 7.5, but again, without hypoglycemia. And using these predictive algorithms, we can be more aggressive because we're less likely to get hypoglycemia. And so it really helps people achieve their goals and really liberates them from some of this fear, some of this worry that I can't be too aggressive because I'm going to cause hypoglycemia.
I think the concept of goals and individualized treatment is something that's really important to mention again for the audience, because this is why every individual is with type 1 diabetes, or type 2 diabetes for that matter as well, is unique and has to have a therapy matched to their lifestyle, their needs, their psychological stress they're under, in order to achieve the best outcome. And of course, that best outcome includes not passing out from hypoglycemia, among other things. Lisa, Eritrea, both of you, I think, are on AID systems, right?
Yeah.
Lisa, yeah. So in your view, and unfortunately the answer to this is already there, because Eritrea told us that she still had an episode of severe hypoglycemia the other night. So it hasn't completely alleviated the issue.
Well, no, because there's a human still here dealing with stuff, right? So there's that human factor.
A human.
So I'm not a perfect human, right? There's times and a quick.
That's not what I was told. I was told
right.
you were perfect.
I know I seem quite perfect, but so honestly, I think that sometimes I overshoot it on the insulin, and that just is what happens. In the specific instance that I gave that happened a couple of weeks ago, what actually happened was that I had an occlused pump site. So I was taking, and my sugar was really high. So I was taking off my site, doing a new site, and I gave myself 10 units to like bring it down, and it was way too much, right? So it's a human error. It wasn't my pump's error. I will say that sleep mode has really changed things. Having a sleep mode on my pump makes me more comfortable going to bed, knowing that even if I don't hear the beeps, my pump's not going to give me a bunch of insulin because it knows I am asleep, right? So that's one thing. But another thing that I think is important and that you mentioned is the individualized therapy to the patient. I have a really, really great relationship with my endocrinologist. I can text her, I can email her. If I do have an episode, we adjust things. And something that we did in the past when I've had my episodes to try to give me some more hypoglycemia awareness is we've raised those targets. So instead of my target blood sugar being 85 to 110, which is what I like to run at, she'll make me run at like 130 to 175. And while that might make me a little bit uncomfortable, it's going to help me have those symptoms of hypoglycemia more in the future if we get me used to it.
Right. And that level over a relatively short time is not going to have a substantially negative impact on long-term complications. I think everybody needs to understand that. And this is where the acute risk versus the chronic risk, hypoglycemia versus hyperglycemia, has to come into play. What do you think the next step should be? Oh, Pratik, you wanted to make a comment. Take yourself off. Good.
Yeah, I just want to. Yeah, I think you highlighted something, but I just want to bring something in here that might come. So a few years ago now, we looked at all the evidence about how do you reduce severe hypoglycemia, how do you reduce the events? And it came up with a kind of a list. The simplest or cheapest intervention is kind of in a group of people, Alan, you talked about those people who bounce around a lot. And often that's because they've not got their carb counting right, their carb ratios right. There's some newer insulins that can be a bit smoother, a bit faster acting or a bit smoother. So there's some simple things. And actually the evidence says, teaching someone carb counting and balancing out their carb ratios and getting their basal bolus balance right about 50-50 solves the problem in half the people when they come to it. Beyond that, about CGM with alarms reduces severe hypo by 70%. So that's your next level. And if you're still getting hypos, using one of the AID systems that Jason talked about drops it a further 50 to 60%, and then you're left with a tiny residual. In that group, so I just want to bring in some research that we did with my mentor, Professor Emil. And we identified, because Eritrea talked about it, which is what triggered my thought, is there's often this kind of what we call thinking traps. And there's probably 3 common thinking traps that we identified. We did a big survey in the T1D exchange data. And Jason Smiley, I think you were part of that study at Jocelyn as well, called HarpDoc. And there's probably 3 things. One is we call it the soldier, that I know I might be having a hypo, but I'm busy having a Zoom call or doing whatever I'm doing. And I'm just going to put off because I want to finish what I'm doing. And then by the time they get to that, they're too low and they're in trouble. So it's delaying treatment. And the second is being so focused on avoiding highs that you say, well, when I'm high, it takes me a while to get down. But if I'm low, I can just have something and I'm up in 20 minutes. So I prioritize avoiding the highs and just overcook it. And that just becomes a habit to say, well, I know I need 2 units, but I'll take 3 just to be safe. And I don't mind the lows. And the third is kind of, we say some people who just kind of, this is my diabetes. I'm just come to terms with it. I have a few seizures, and you put people around you that protect you, and then you don't deal with a problem. And so in London, we developed a CBT-based modality that challenges some of those thinking processes, and was very successful. And there's a similar program in the US called BGAT again, which was equally successful in that trial. So, and then in the UK, of course, when those fell through, we still had the backup of transplantation, which I'm sure we'll come on to.
May I say
that's
something?
exactly where we're going. Go ahead, Lisa.
So Dr. Chaudhry, I'm glad that you ended up on that note of sort of a mental, a therapeutic approach to dealing with these hypos, because, to point out to my CGM, I get my Dexcom report at the end of the week, right? This is where you're at. And I do live in irrational fear of going low. So then I'll show it to my CDE. And she'll say, but Lisa, it's only 1% that you were very low. Yeah. But I have this crazy fear of it. So to add to what you said, Alan, when you said, this data can help to manage your patient physically, did you say physiologically? I'm not quite sure, but I would add psychologically. I'm sitting here saying, I have to talk to my therapist. I have to figure this out because I have all of the latest treatments. I have everything except for the G7. That's the only thing I don't have yet. But, and I think it's just a psychological thing, because then I still want to run my sugars higher than I should, even though I'm not going low, dangerously low.
And so that really brings us beautifully, and Pratik mentioned this with islet transplantation. Let's talk for a moment about the cure, in quotes, because it's been a buzzword in type 1 diabetes for years. And, for a while it seemed more like a dream and more science fiction than science. But today we're actually making some real progress. The FDA hasn't approved islet transplantation in the US. We do have proof of concept, of course, that islets from pancreas donors can restore normal or near normal glucose control in many individuals with type 1 with immunosuppression. And now we have evidence, and again, proof of concept, an investigational study, that stem cell derived beta cells can do the same. So, these are major advances, but it's not quite ready for prime time. And, one of the issues that's come up, and we've discussed it very briefly, is the concept that you need to have severe hypoglycemia in order to get into a trial to study beta cell replacement, and whether that actually is a good thing or a bad thing for the development of cell transplantation, beta cell replacement, in an era when we have AID systems that reduce the risk of severe hypoglycemia? I mean, can you get enough patients to enter these trials? So that's really the question. And that goes first to Pratik and Jason, and then I'll be interested in the comments from Lisa and Eritrea, because we're coming to the end of the formal part of our discussion. Well, we could go for another couple of hours, I'm sure, with the amount of material.
So I think the thinking, I was involved. I run the islet transplant program at King's for 15 years, and we saw people with recurrent severe hypos. And actually, 85% of people referred to my clinic with recurrent severe hypos, and many people would have had 50, 80, 100 glucagon requiring severe hypos the year prior to coming to me. With an expert team who've got experience of recognizing the different problems, using that leveled approach, we sort people's problems out without transplantation. And so we transplanted a handful of people, but when we did, it worked really well. And the reason why we were very selective was because we knew the risks of immunosuppression. And also we knew that those donor cells were very rare. We had to, if we can sort things out without, then we'll manage that. So in terms of the kind of physical cost, the cost from complications, I can kind of see the argument that you need to be a place where actually the risk of not doing anything is far worse, but as things move forward, and if we can get to cell-based transplantation where the requirement for immunotherapy is lower, then that should widen out. And I think that's where probably Jason comes in with some of the newer therapies he's been working with.
And Jason, comments?
Yeah, so first I just want to echo what Pratik said. That was exactly our experience at the NIH as well. The vast majority of people who referred to us for islet transplantation did not need islet transplantation. They needed a good endocrinologist, someone that they could work with. And then their severe hypoglycemia, they were no longer experiencing it, and they no longer felt that they needed it. And it really is a balance. And the FDA guidance from this, it's somewhat older. It's from 2009. And we're in a different environment now because we do have automated insulin delivery. What I can tell you is that even at the NIH, we transplanted some people who they knew diabetes, they knew severe hypoglycemia because that's what they were suffering. And then they got their islet transplant, maybe even became insulin independent. And some of these people then chose to go off of immunosuppression because it was the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. And at that point, they knew both of them. And they went back to deciding they wanted the disease of type 1 diabetes versus the disease of immunosuppression. And so I agree, it's difficult because you know diabetes, but you don't know immunosuppression. Now, there are newer therapies that are being developed that hopefully won't require immunosuppression. And I think that totally changes the calculation and was not addressed by the FDA guidance. And my concern around this is regulators are saying, well, you need to not be at goal to be eligible to participate in a clinical trial. And what does that mean? Because goals are individualized and it has to be what's right for that patient. And so I am a little bit concerned that we're being overly paternalistic and that, these people who want to participate in conjunction with the people who are offering the clinical trials and know what the risks are of it should be able to decide, does it make sense or not for them? Not your A1C is too good, especially because I can game that. If you tell me I need an A1C above 7 to get something, I can make my A1C be above 7. It just doesn't seem, it seems it puts perverse incentives on these things.
Yeah. Lisa, Eritrea, what are your feelings about this? I know, Lisa, you've spent a lot of time thinking about beta cell transplantation, islet replacement therapy, and the early trials in this. How do you think this plays into the evolution of this technology?
I think I know what Lisa's going to say, so I'm just going to start off with being the devil's advocate and say that when Dr. Gagley said that it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't, he absolutely echoed my thoughts. I am not huge on a cure. I would rather continue to live with the disease that I've lived with for a long time. And I also ask myself, what kind of access to that cure is going to actually exist for people who are lower income and don't even have access to AID? So these are the questions I really ask myself when people bring up cures, things like that. So I'm not super interested, but all respect to Lisa and everything that she's done for the community. I want to be very clear about that.
But you bring up, Eritrea, some very important social elements to the prospect of achieving equity in diabetes treatment, whether it's with cell replacement therapy or even CGM and certainly AID. But Lisa?
No, that's a very good point, Eritrea. Like, if we can't get insulin to everybody now who needs it, I mean, we're in a better place. But, you know, this disparity exists. So imagine if there's a treatment that is going to cost a lot of money. Well, who's going to get it? And I have to say, I think it's okay to say this. So I showed the film to Justice Sonia Sotomayor. You know, she has type 1.
Mm-hmm.
And her very first question to me was, so if this works, how are we going to get it to the people, to everybody? And I was like, could you help me with that? But yes, no, it's an issue. And my hope is that there will be enough, you know, management consultants, or it seems to me what I filmed for ViaCyte, I filmed them at a very early stage, talking to consultants about how to manage the healthcare insurance. And if this works, how do we get it to the most people? How do we make it so it's actually affordable? So it's not a Hep C situation. And, you know, it seems to me that at least the one biotech I followed for 8 years, they were doing their best to figure out how it would work and how to understand that healthcare system. Now, mind you, we have many different healthcare systems in this world. So it's not a simple answer, but Eritrea, the cure is worth it. The cure is worth it because it will scale up and it will become, I believe, available to the people who need it. And we all need one. I believe we all need one. And people are dying from it. I'm very sorry for your loss. People are dying from it around the world. 6.7 million people died in 2021, 3 out of 4 in developing countries. I hope that we can bring this to everybody. And I'm not sure how long it's going to take. I'll do the best I can. I'll lobby. I'll go to DC. I'll bang on drums. We'll do something.
You have lobbied, and I think all of you have clearly contributed to the richness of this discussion and to the education for everybody listening, whether they have type 1 diabetes and hypoglycemia or not. So we're going to turn now to some questions from the audience. I had a lot more that I was going to ask you. We don't have time for it, unfortunately. I really appreciate your the expertise you bring to this and the personal experience with both type 1 diabetes and hypoglycemia more specifically, because it's added to our understanding of some of the issues that people face. But let's turn for a moment to some questions from the audience, and they're not going to be thrown to any one individual. Please chip in here where you have some knowledge. There's a question about whether low-carb diets, keto-based diets, because of the way the brain alters its metabolism of glucose versus ketone bodies, actually helps protect against hypoglycemia. Is there any data to that? In fact, none that I know of, but...
So I think the way I think about it, so there's a couple of balancing risks here with ketones, right? So if you've got a very low carb diet, then you have much lower quick acting insulin, so you have a little bit less fluctuation, right? And so that your risk of hypoglycemia from getting your quick acting wrong is lower. But because you don't have any carbs, you don't have any glycogen in your liver. So if you do go low, then you're going to need more carbs to bail yourself out, right? Because when Eritrea or Lisa, if you go low, some of it you're relying on your liver to release some glucose to bring you back up again. And that's why, you know, if you're alone at home, Eritrea, you know, ultimately, even if you do go low, you will wake up because your liver will release some glucose. But if you haven't put any there because you're on a keto diet, you're at higher risk. Right? And it ties into something that I was going to say earlier. Eritrea, you're saying sports. So we know that exercise increases your risk of hypoglycemia and also reduces the amount of glucose your liver releases if you are low. So there's that cycle, and that's where sports people are at higher risk. And again, people who follow ketogenic diets often do more exercise. So actually going on ketones, the reduced risk from not getting your quick acting wrong might be counterbalanced by the fact that you don't have any glycogen in your liver. So and the brain glucose uptake story, I think there's very little evidence to say that you significantly increase your brain. The brain uses ketones rather than glucose separately.
So I gather, to put it into simple words, you're not recommending ketogenic diets for people with type 1 diabetes to avoid hypoglycemia. Okay. And I think we have a data desert here, right? As well. What about, is there any evidence that suggests that CGM has contributed to decreased awareness of hypoglycemia? In other words, are more people running lower because they're using CGM and that's contributing to hypo unawareness?
All the evidence says, so all the real world evidence says that the rate of people going to hospital having severe hypos is significantly reduced. In the UK, it's about a 70% reduction, France, 70% reduction. So CGM is stopping people having severe hypos. I think people are more aware of, you're getting low sensor glucose, there's that false sensor glucose. So people think that they're less aware than they really are because they're seeing a lot of these asymptomatic lows on the sensor that you might see. But overall, because on sensor you're having lower hypos, you're reducing your risk of hypo unawareness overall, or severe hypo.
Jason, any comments?
Yeah, no, I think this is an observer bias in that you're seeing more lows because you're detecting them. They were happening before, you just didn't know about it.
Right.
You said it much clearer than I did.
That's why we were translating to American English, Pratik. There's a question about inhaled insulin. Is there any evidence that inhaled insulin as a bolus, obviously, can help reduce the incidence of hypoglycemia?
Jason, I don't know. You've got.
I've never seen this directly studied. I mean, the kinetics are such that it's faster on and faster off. And insulins, I believe that we have another question about this as well, so I'll just combine them. So the move to ultra rapid insulins is a way that we can address this, in that a lot of people, they have a concern because they have these postprandial spikes. And so then they take more insulin to avoid the postprandial spike, but then you go low later on after the meal. So by using a faster acting insulin, you kind of get out of that cycle because you're not taking the extra insulin to avoid that postprandial spike. You're just taking a faster insulin. So it's faster on, faster off, and then you'll have less hypoglycemia. So I do know data for the ultra rapids that supports this. Yeah. I don't know any data for the inhaled, but in theory, it should be the same because of the faster on and the faster off.
And of course, I think we, to take this discussion away from the AID systems we were just talking about to reduce the risk of hypoglycemia, when we talk about, I think, Jason, when you're talking about bolus insulin now, you're talking about MDI therapy, multiple daily injection therapy. The role of rapid-acting insulins in a pump, actually, ultra-rapid-acting insulin should also improve the kinetics of insulin and smooth out the glycemic profile, not necessarily have a specific effect on episodes of more or less hypoglycemia, to my knowledge.
Well, no, but you can do the same thing with your mealtime bolus. It will act faster. And so there's less concern for trying to do a pre-bolus, which again does put you at risk for hypoglycemia if you don't eat what you think you're going to eat. Right. And so again, it goes on faster, it comes off faster. So that initial bolus, even though the AID can smooth the other things, you're still in a better place with these ultra rapid insulins with these pumps.
And with the insulin that we've got at with the insulins that we've got at the moment, Jason's highlighting on it. So what a lot of people who are worried about hypoglycemia do, for exactly the reason Jason said, is those insulins you have to take them 15 minutes pre. So a lot of people will take them as they eat or probably after they eat because they know what they've done. But the data says that if you take that insulin post-meal, you have a 30% higher risk of hypo later on. Mm-hmm. And then with CGM, you take your bolus. If you've not done it early enough, you see it going up. And I've got a lot of people who they're a bit tentative with their bolus and they see it going up, then take a bit more, then take a bit more, and then it all stacks up. So actually trying to avoid hypoglycemia, you inadvertently cause more and end up in the cycle. And so getting the insulin in early before the meal, using the fastest insulin you can, reduces your risk of a lot of hypo happens at about 2.5 hours post meal.
Right. And it is rapid acting insulin that's the real culprit.
Yeah.
Right. My understanding is that the rapid acting insulin doesn't really peak until 2 hours, even rapid acting, even FIASP.
Maybe 50, 60 minutes.
No.
Yeah, 60 minutes.
How many? 60
sooner
minutes?
than 2 hours.
Yeah.
Sooner than 2 hours. Okay, got it. Sooner than 2 hours.
Yep. About an hour.
But if you're, but as you say, Dr. Chaudhry, like if you're taking it after you eat, then the carb might have already emptied out of your stomach, and boom, you're going to go low.
So it's like
a
before
chasing lows. roller
So
coaster.
taking it early is really important, reduces your risk of hypoglycemia. But actually, it's quite easy to see logically, I think, oh, I'm scared of hypos, I'll eat first and then take the insulin. And paradoxically, that increases your risk of hypoglycemia.
So I think, one of the things to take home from this little discussion here is that no matter how good your diabetes therapy is, there are still challenges. And that's why I know Lisa came back to the concept that if you can replace the smart cell, the beta cell, that knows what to do at the right time and in the right amount, you can get around some of these issues. Now, recognizing that there are other issues involved with that. But I think it's one of the reasons that the technology is being pushed forward the way it is today. Not addressing the issue of equity in terms of distribution of the cell. Doctor, there's an interesting question here, a conceptual question about how you deal with hypoglycemia with CGM. Dr. Shah from Barbara Davis asked whether time below range should be presented as the number of events instead of time below range, given that every hypo is clinically meaningful and potentially dangerous. In other words, how should reports from CGM be displayed and be acted upon?
I think it's a question I don't think we really know the answer to. We're exploring that, and our hypermetric study we did kind of says that. And we know that probably being low when you're asleep is probably, you should be lower. So although that's when you're at higher risk and people are more scared of it, actually I think having a glucose between 50 and 70 when you're asleep, the average duration of nighttime hypos is 70, 80 minutes, right? And it seems to have no real impact on people. So I think different events have different importance. And I know there's a lot of fear about they're really dangerous. I think hypos are dangerous in a particular cohort of people who are a particular risk for them. And the vast majority of people actually can have low center glucose. I don't think short events below 54 are actually particularly harmful. It's the ones that you lose consciousness from and run into real trouble are actually down in the 40s for a long duration, for an hour or so. And with modern technology, most events are short, sharp dips into the 50s or 60s, which actually don't put you at any major risk. So I think the way we look at which events are dangerous involving the depth and the duration is something we're looking at. And there's a big NIH funded project actually that I'm part of in people with impaired awareness that will address that. So it's a really important question. Yeah.
Terrific. I wish we had more time. We don't. I mean, there are more questions that I have and some of our audience has. And I know there's a lot more that you panelists can contribute. But I want to thank you again for your time, your expertise, your devotion to helping people with diabetes, whether you're a person with diabetes or you're a physician caring for people with diabetes. Hypoglycemia remains a challenge. I think we're getting a little more handle of it than we had 10 years ago with some of the new systems, and that's terrific, but it hasn't gone away, as you've learned today. And that opens up the need for developing new therapies and refining current therapies to reduce that risk as much as we possibly can. So I want to thank the audience for participating in this. I hope you've learned something. I certainly have, and I really appreciate, again, the time and energy of our panelists. Thank you. And for the audience, we hope to see you back for other panels on other topics in the future. It's one of the things that we are so proud of at diaTribe, to be able to reach both professionals and people with diabetes to help them do better in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.